Most modern Christians assume that Paul's letters were written directly to or about them. This assumption is rarely questioned, even though Paul was writing to specific audiences in the first century within Israel's covenant world. When Romans 11 is read carefully in its historical and textual context, it becomes clear that Paul is not addressing humanity in general. He is speaking about Israel, its divisions, its restoration, and the reassembly of its covenant community during the final period of the Old Covenant age. As N.T. Wright notes, Paul's theology is not about abstract, timeless truths, but about the climax of Israel's story in its own historical moment. Romans 11 describes how Israel's fractured covenant body was being healed. Paul explains why some Israelites had rejected the gospel, why others believed, and how people previously considered covenant outsiders were being brought into the covenant community through faith in Christ, rather than through Torah observance. The chapter is therefore not about the salvation of the world or the creation of a new universal religion. It is about the restoration and reunification of Israel. James D.G. Dunn affirms this directly. Olive tree represents Israel as the historical people of God, sustained by the patriarchal promises. Paul's olive tree metaphor describes four groups. The root represents the patriarchal promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These promises formed the covenant foundation of Israel. The natural branches represent Israelites who belong to the covenant people by origin. The broken branches represent Israelites who rejected the gospel and were therefore cut off from covenant participation. The wild branches grafted in represent people who were not originally part of Israel's covenantal structure, but who became attached to it through faith or other lawful means. These included diaspora Israelites who had been estranged from covenant life, proselytes, Samaritans, and uncircumcised God-fearers associated with the synagogue world. As Shea J.D. Cohen explains, in antiquity, Jew and Gentile were not purely ethnic categories, but social and religious distinctions that could change. All of these groups existed within Israel's covenant orbit. Paul's argument concerns who would belong to the restored covenant community, not the conversion of unrelated pagan nations. Right at the beginning of Romans 11, Paul states that God has not rejected Israel. He says in Romans 11, 1-2, I ask, "Then, has God rejected his people? By no means, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew." Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the phrase "his people" refers to Israel. The covenant relationship described in the Bible existed between Israel and their God. This is made explicit in the prophets like Amos. Amos 3:2 says, "You only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities." When Paul says God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew, he is speaking about Israel. The issue under discussion is not the salvation of humanity, but the fate of Israel during its final covenant crisis. In Romans 11:3-4, Paul then appeals to the story of Elijah. "Lord, they have killed your prophets. I have kept for myself 7,000 men." Paul is invoking a familiar pattern from Israel's history. During times of national apostasy, God preserved a faithful remnant within Israel. In Romans 11:5, Paul explains that the same situation existed in his own time. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. A remnant is not a brand new people. It is a faithful portion of an existing people. The remnant Paul describes consists of Israelites who believed the gospel while much of the nation remained hardened. As Douglas Moo notes, the remnant concept is firmly rooted in Israel's history and refers to a subset within Israel, not a new entity. Paul then says in Romans 11:7, "What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. Notice the subject of the passage. Israel sought righteousness. Some obtained it, others did not. Paul is not discussing the spiritual condition of the entire human race. He's explaining a division within Israel itself. In Romans 11:8, Paul reinforces this point by quoting Isaiah, "God gave them a spirit of stupor." This is drawn from Isaiah 29:9-10, a prophecy directed at Israel. Paul's audience would have understood the reference because they were people connected to Israel's scriptural world. The discussion then turns to one of the most misunderstood parts of the chapter, the role of the ethne. In Romans 11:11, Paul says through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles. The Greek word ethnos means nations or peoples. In Jewish usage, the term often referred to non-Jews, but in the first-century synagogue world, it also referred more broadly to people who were not part of the Judean Jewish community, yet lived within Israel's covenant sphere, such as diaspora Israelites, proselytes, and God-fearers. Lewis Feldman notes that large numbers of Gentiles were attracted to Judaism and participated in synagogue life as God-fearers. The tension Paul describes reflects this covenant context. Judean Jews often viewed these groups as outsiders, diaspora Israelites who had abandoned Torah observance, Samaritans whose ancestry and practices were disputed, and uncircumcised God-fearers were frequently regarded as religious inferiors. Yet Paul was proclaiming that these people could be incorporated into the covenant community through faith in Christ without first becoming Torah-observant Jews. That message provoked intense jealousy. This is precisely the scenario Moses anticipated. In Romans 1:19, Paul said, "I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation." This quotation comes from Deuteronomy 32:21. As Jason A. Staples explains, Paul's use of Deuteronomy reflects intra-Israel dynamics rather than the replacement of Israel. In Hosea, Israel is described as becoming not my people, yet later being restored. This language refers to covenant estrangement followed by restoration. Paul applies this imagery to people who had been treated as covenant outsiders but were now being restored through faith. This explains the jealousy described in Acts 13 when the Jews saw the crowds. They were filled with jealousy. If Gentiles in Romans 11 refers to unrelated pagan nations, then the burden is to demonstrate 1. Where Paul defines them that way in this chapter. 2. How such groups meaningfully fit Israel's olive tree structure. 3. How they produce the specific jealousy dynamic Paul describes. Jewish opposition to Paul's mission did not arise simply because foreigners existed. Jews had long interacted with foreigners. The scandal was that people previously considered covenant outsiders were being declared full covenant participants. Samaritans provide a clear example in John 4:9, which says Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Although Samaritans shared Israelite ancestry, they were treated as outsiders. This reflects how covenant identity functioned socially, not strictly biologically. Paul then states in Romans 11:15, "For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world," the reconciliation. Paul describes concerns Israel's covenant world. As N.T. Wright observes, world, cosmos, in Paul often denotes the sphere of God's covenant dealings rather than the entire planet. In prophetic language, exile was described as death and restoration as life. Therefore, life from the dead refers to covenant restoration, not biological resurrection. The olive tree metaphor illustrates this restoration. The tree remains Israel. As Dunn states, there is only one olive tree, the people of God as defined by the Abrahamic covenant. In Romans 11:25, Paul explains that this process would continue until Israel's restoration was complete. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the ethne has come in. This fullness refers to the completion of the ingathering. It echoes Israel's own expansion language in Genesis 48:19, not the creation of a separate global entity. In Romans 11:26, Paul concludes, and in this way all Israel will be saved. The outcome is not a worldwide religion, but the restoration of Israel itself. As Wright summarizes, Paul's aim is to show how God is faithful to Israel, not how Israel is replaced. The fractured covenant community, divided by unbelief, estrangement, and hostility, was being reunited through faith in the Messiah. Romans 11 describes the final stage of Israel's covenant story, the healing of its divisions and the reassembly of its people before the end of the Old Covenant age. It does not describe the ongoing expansion of Christianity among modern nations. It explains how Israel's covenant community was restored during the first century. Once that restoration reached completion, the story itself reached its conclusion.